Welcome. Good evening. This is the First Amendment Historically Speaking. My name is Frederick Douglass Dixon, and I will be your host. We always like to thank UPTV for allowing us to come before you and forward what we consider to be esoteric information that hopefully will be a part of your discussions at home, a part of discussions that further go outside the home and lead into the community. And I'd like to thank the entire staff here, more specifically Daniel, a young man who works with me very closely and helps me out so very much. So without the laborers, we would not be here, and it wouldn't be such a great idea. So I thank you so very much for UPTV and the entire staff. As being very close, we're on the cusp of Black History Month. We discussed last week the brilliance of Dr. Carter G. Woodson. So in that vein, we want to continue to highlight some of the people, some of those esoteric figures who have placed in society a record that has been left behind, and some left behind but lessened, some left behind and eliminated. And today we want to talk about a very important historical figure, a lady, a woman who was above and beyond the call of her time, which put her ahead of the game, if you will, colloquially speaking. And one who lots of people have heard her name, lots of people have even perhaps studied some of the things that she's done. But for those of you all who have never heard, and those of you all who've heard, just a slight story about the greatness of Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells is indeed a heroine, and more so a hero in her own forwarding of information, as well as her actions, her writings, her militancy to America. And I am one that understands the importance of the role of women. When we look at any movement, those who did the heavy lifting, those who did the organizing, from the standpoint of actually making things happen, always fall on the side of the woman. The responsibilities of pulling things together from the very outset to the very last minute have been with the guise of women being leads and then historically erased. So when we talk about top-down leadership, we want to reverse that top-down leadership and look at the movement or any thought from the ground up. And then we want to highlight the role of women to give us a more complete picture of any historical episode, more specifically when we look at the tale or the saga of Black women here in America. This is for future generations. The very youngest is the most important. So we want to provide these young Black young ladies, heroines and heroes, so they can look to and research so that they can find folks who look just like them, who were thinking about them and sacrificing for them years before they had any commitment to any other populations. So Ida B. Wells is indeed worthy of our mentioning, worthy of putting in a proper perspective during Black History Month, which will begin Sunday. So we are indeed attuned, we are indeed right on time with the idea of forwarding Ida B. Wells' thought. And if it's proper, then we must begin at the beginning. So when we talk about Ida B. Wells, we're talking about a historical figure. We're talking about someone with the fortitude of a soldier, someone whose life was consistently on the line as she completed her work. She was indeed one who stood out amongst lots of folks who did very brilliant work. But the story of Ida B. Wells must be told for the youngest to understand her importance and her brilliance. So when we talk about the beginning of Ida B. Wells, Holly Springs, Mississippi, born 1862 as a slave. This in turn ties directly to the time that 1863 would bring about the Emancipation Proclamation and what it would forward and endure for years to come. So she's born on the cusp of the Emancipation Proclamation signed January 1st, 1863 by the very famous president, Abraham Lincoln. So there are historical facts upcoming during the Civil War. These particular points cannot be left out or we miss out. So Ida B. Wells in herself was one who understood sacrifice, and furthermore, she had a vision. And her vision seems at this particular point, as we look back, to be unlimited, but it was all about sacrifice. She tackled some of the most important issues of her day, unlike some of our so-called black heroes today who tackle less important issues and more specifically absorb or tied into material culture, which separates them from the masses of blacks, which in turn turns us to look at our situation and those who are leading us today. So being born a slave, not very long, but being born a slave, her parents were very much so politically active. So this starts in the home for Ida B. Wells. She sees her parents as those who are part of the Republican Party during Reconstruction. This is how her early life begins to form. And her dad, James, was a very brilliant man, one who taught, one who led, and he in himself was a part of the Freedmen's Aid Society and also a part of Shaw University, now Russ College, very first board of trustees. So her mother and her father, both of these particular people were very attuned to sacrifice, which in itself, we know all behaviors are learned, was part of her youth. So when we talk directly about her youth, she was a very brilliant student. She was a very brilliant young lady, but she was also one who was responsible for siblings. She was the eldest. She was the one who, and if anyone out there is the eldest of the siblings, there's a different responsibility that falls upon your shoulders, that falls upon their shoulders. There is a connection to the parent and an extension of the arm of what the parent sees fit. So Ida B. Wells falls right along in those lines as one who took responsibility of her siblings. And at age 16, a very tragic event takes place during Ida B. Wells' life. At 16, there was what they called a breakout or an outbreak of what we know now as yellow fever in that part of Mississippi, which killed her parents. And some say her parents died in the same month, some say the same week. So all of a sudden, her world is turned around and she becomes the caregiver for younger siblings. Now, if anybody has ever had that situation occur, or anybody who's known someone, how devastating that can be to one person's life, Ida B. Wells was charged with raising her siblings. So even in that stressful situation, the position that she was in, she was very convinced that higher education, formal education, would be a ticket for her to include and make sure that those who would come behind her could understand the power of formal education. Now, we have to put this in a proper perspective, in a proper context, in a historical timeline. This is coming on the heels of several legal and systematic ordinances that forbade blacks to read. So the want of education, the want of the ability to be literate and to forward that to future generations is directly tied in her fortitude and her sacrifice. And in 1882, she travels to Memphis. She leaves Mississippi, travels to Memphis to live with her aunt. Her brother travels with her. And for a while, she begins to and continues her education, formal education, at what we know now to be Fisk University. So many brilliant giants of our past have come through that part of the world, who have come through Fisk. Ida B. Wells is one to be noted in that same vein. Now, with Ida B. Wells and traveling to Memphis, these tie into future stories, future arms of history, future antennas of history that we will go over in this very small time. It would be remiss for me to talk about Ida B. Wells in a half an hour, so this, you all, is just a segment. This is just an introduction, something that will, if you will, for lack of a better term, wet your whistle about the importance of Ida B. Wells, and hopefully this will be a catalyst for you to go and find out some more esoteric facts about Ida B. Wells. It is very important that the children understand her brilliance. So there was a part of Ida B. Wells that was extremely radical. During her youth and what she saw and the raising and the lessons that were passed in her household, she had a fortitude that was a tad bit different than we perhaps understand now and would accept today from someone who's other than a man. So with Ida B. Wells, she understood the power that she had, that she possessed as a black woman in the South. She was never one who thought that she didn't have power. She was very serious about honing that power. She also challenged the system with that same fortitude. So that was a train ride that she took in Memphis right around May of 1884, where she purchased a first-class ticket. Now, at the time, this is the most popular way to travel. Now, historically, allow me to tie the story together. 1884. This is prior to Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, which in itself challenges segregations of the railway cars. So 12 years prior to the decision of Plessy versus Ferguson, which gives us separate but equal, she herself, Ida B. Wells, is challenging the system that will eventually go to the Supreme Court. So she's 12 years ahead of the game. She's indeed challenging the system. And she, at this particular time, she begins to refuse to remove herself from the first class seat that she purchased. So this, in tune, leads to the brilliance of Ida B. Wells, along with the connection to something we hear all the time about the brilliance of Rosa Parks. So when you put these events on a historical timeline, and you also look to those who had the fortitude to understand situations and not back down and challenge, Ida B. Wells is definitely that person. So on this particular train ride, she in herself refuses to give up her seat. Sounds historically familiar. So I have to forward to you all, there were several people who refused to give their seats up. Those who have been erased from history to remove the fortitude of this particular generation's thoughts. So Ida B. Wells refuses to move. She gets into a literal fight with the conductors. She actually sues the railway and wins $500. Unheard of at the time. But let's go back to reality and find out that later the Tennessee Supreme Court overturned the victory. So legally and systematically, we are looking at a time that continuously removes the struggle or the will to resist from the masses of black people to look to legal and other means as a source of brilliance, as a source of being able to change policies or create an avenue of expertise. So no, although Ida B. Wells won the very first particular portion of this legal case, it was indeed struck down by the Tennessee Supreme Court. So Ida B. Wells in herself had the idea of challenging systems, and she was a brilliant writer. Most folks know that the brilliance of Ida B. Wells lies in her writing. So her being an author, she's left a lot of things behind, some that are overwhelmingly written in her name and some that were not. She was wise enough to know that the topics that she would discuss, and she was one hero for anti-lynching, which was the topic of the time, as if the topic now has changed from black men being killed. No, it has remained the same. But what we see now with Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown is a different sort of lynching. Ida B. Wells was attuned. She was indeed fighting the lynching that was the Mike Brown and the killing of Trayvon Martin of that day. And she indeed had friends who became victims of this particular thought. And she also understood how the written word would tie into the ability to be more serious for black people if they could get their hands on her written word. So she used the moniker Lola when she wrote several articles. And she was an owner of the Memphis free speech, as well as the Highlight and the Free Speech, two different newspapers, Memphis Free Speech and the Free Speech. So she was such a person who understood what we would now say as social media, or the ability to connect to the masses of people that she was writing to and that she was writing about and those she was challenging. She understood the power of the pen, and her brilliance allowed it to tackle anti-lynching and make her one who was very much so at the forefront of this campaign. So she worked as a school teacher as well. So her brilliance has no end. She's a warrior. She's a formal person of education who begins to teach. All of these things come from her household. She's an author, and she takes on the most critical issues of her time. So Ida B. Wells teaches in Memphis public segregated schools. Well, she started that at a very young age. Even they say, some historians have said at the earliest age of 16, when she convinced school board people who had the positions of who would teach what, that she was 18 years of age and that she was able to teach the class. Now, her ability was never questioned. But at the age of 16, she found herself in a formal educational setting around people who were her age, perhaps older, and she was still forwarding educational thought. This in turn proves her diligence to the uplifting of the entire masses of humanity, more specifically, black people in America who were just freed. So when we talk about Ida B. Wells, we need to go straight to a point about Ida B. Wells that perhaps on the outside of her train ride, which caused such a stir, another particular incident in Ida B. Wells' life that became a turning point or a crossroads. In 1892, three friends of Ida B. Wells, Mr. Thomas Moss, Mr. Calvin McDowell, and Mr. William Stewart, who were entrepreneurs, grocery store owners in Memphis, and in the black community as it is today. These particular men were looking to create a sense of wealth by servicing their own population. There's not another group on the planet who does not service their own population. And there is not another group on the planet today who has more entrepreneurs and those who are merchants inside their community to remove that dollar than the black community. This is historically documented and is still relevant today. So these particular men became competition for those white grocers in that area. So the idea of these white grocers losing money, losing funding, and losing their ability to go into the black community and remove funding became very much so a point of sore contention. So these particular men understood that they would be challenged by this same group of white grocers. So they began to arm themselves at night and stay all night on guard at the grocery store. So one night it came to a head. There were several confrontations, words being passed, but one night there was a huge confrontation where there was a mob that was created by these white grocers to make sure that they would take out their competition. So these young men armed themselves, and there was a shootout. And there were white men who were injured. There were white men who were killed. And these three men were charged with the murder. So Ida B. Wells begins to use her pen to stick up for her three buddies and begin to look at Memphis and call Memphis exactly what it is. And her pen was so sharp that it caused such a stir that her life became at risk. So with the lynching of her three friends, Mr. Moss, Mr. McDowell, and Mr. Stewart, Ida B. Wells wrote incendiary articles about what happened, the situation, and the institution of lynching, she becomes more in-depth, and she exposes Memphis and those who played a part in this particular instance. So one way that was forwarded to a generation to get themselves under the yoke and the bondage of what we know as the lynching as a social construct was to remove yourself from that particular area. Leave the vicinity. So Ida B. Wells instructs the masses of blacks in Memphis to move to Tulsa, Oklahoma. We'll return to that thought. But she instructs through her pen, her written word, to leave Memphis, or we will become far more subjected to these particular atrocities that happened to Mr. McDowell, Mr. Moss, and Mr. Stewart. Ida B. Wells, her life becomes at risk because of the thing that she's writing. And she is told not to return to Memphis by friends. And when she understands the depth of the way that she sits in this situation, she does not return to Memphis during that particular time. But when she does return to Memphis, it is found that her newspaper office has been torn apart. Every printing press has been stolen. And now she looks at does not further have the ability to forward this pen that was connecting poor whites with the anti-lynching and finding out that there was not much difference in class between the poor white and the poor black, which was indeed a threat. Ida B. Wells begins to use her authority and her popularity to ask people to remove themselves from Memphis, Tennessee. Now, this is where it becomes very interesting. Years later, as people in themselves did travel from Memphis to Tulsa, Oklahoma, which was known to have the largest amount of black millionaires in a concentrated area at that time on the planet. So they say that Tulsa, Oklahoma was very prosperous for blacks, and Memphis was not. So Ida B. Wells becomes a leader for those to pick up and leave Memphis, to exclude themselves from what will happen in Memphis, which we know Tulsa, Oklahoma, very well documented 1921, the death of Black Wall Street. These are some of the steps, ipso facto, that sets up Tulsa, Oklahoma. So Ida B. Wells' thought is historically being challenged, but she's historically continuing to move along at a pace that is neck speed, breakneck speed. Ida B. Wells in herself begins to spend months traveling in the South and recording the atrocities of lynching. And one book that you can find them in is Southern Horrors and Other Writings. Excellent book. And she begins to put, if you will, those who commit these atrocities on Front Street. And now you can get your hands on these books. And she's so very popular that she continues to write, continues to write. So when we look to Ida B. Wells, we need to find the connection in the northern portion of America. We can find Ida B. Wells, 1893, at the Chicago Fair, the Columbian Exposition. Now, she was a part and had a lead part in the Arts and Crafts Exposition. And there's only one building left from the 1893 World Fair, Columbian Exposition, and that is now what we know as the Museum of Science and Industry. And that indeed was the building that housed the Arts and Crafts Exposition. So she was over that with a very brilliant and very famous abolitionist, Frederick Douglass. So now, as she travels to Chicago, she spends 1893 and very small portions of 1894 with Frederick Douglass. And we all know that Frederick Douglass was an abolitionist. He supported Ida B. Wells, and they were good friends. So to understand Ida B. Wells, 1893, Chicago's Columbian Exposition, and her connection to Frederick Douglass, all these historical facts All these will remove the idea of misnomers, especially the idea of Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells being together for very close to a year. Now, Frederick Douglass, he dies in 1895, so literally in 1894, that's the last year of his life. And prior to that, he spends it with Ida B. Wells. How historically connected is that? So she becomes so very upset with the 1893 World Expedition that they are excluding the actual accomplishments of blacks that she writes a very poignant pamphlet called The Reason Why Colored America is Not Represented in the World Columbian Expedition. She's backed up by so many famous authors and writers and those who understand Ida B. Wells' brilliance. So Ida B. Wells, 1896, formed the National Association of Colored Women. And after a brutal assault in Springfield, 1908, and the following year, 1909, some say that she had a lot to do with the idea of the NAACP being formed, 1909. Well, if you believe that, then you need to understand who financed the NAACP, and you look to a last name named Spingarn, Joel Spingarn. So when you look at the NAACP Image Award to this day, it doesn't say NAACP Image Award, it says the Spingarn Award, which was in itself Jewish philanthropy to control the thought of blacks. So Ida B. Wells is indeed a hero. She dies of kidney disease at the age of 69, 1931 in Chicago, Illinois, a place that is my home. Her actual address, 3624 South King Drive, which there is a home there with red and white awnings that you have a historical marker. Feel free to travel there. Feel free to get outside and take pictures. Her daughter, Ida B. Wells' papers are at the University of Chicago's Regenstein's Library in Special Collections. Her daughter, Mrs. Duster, 6646 South Woodlawn at one time. Very brilliant, very brilliant. So to Ida B. Wells, during Black History Month, as we set up Black History Month, we celebrate Ida B. Wells. We celebrate her accomplishments. We celebrate her fortitude. We celebrate that for the youngest person who's looking, especially for you young ladies who are looking for heroes. Indeed, Ida B. Wells is definitely worthy as a hero, if not a saint. When we have seen people who have been placed into sainthood by the Catholic Church, I am today placing Ida B. Wells in sainthood of Black history. We indeed appreciate everything and all her thoughts that she forwarded. Ladies and gentlemen, this information may in no means change your life, but because truth and you are so very important to me, I just thought you ought to know. I remain, with esteem and respect, Frederick Douglass Dixon, a distinguished man of color. Thank you, Ida B. Wells.